Cue the school counselor. I'm a high school teacher and taught among other subjects politics at my previous school. We were briefed over and over again to be on the lookout for any sign that a student might be in psychological distress. While I do understand that it is part of my job, I was always shaking my head in disbelief when we were given the list of possible symptoms: mood swings, irritability, lack of interest in schools, underperformance, changes in interests, etc. Since I work with teenagers, that list applies to about 90% of them. So obviously, that list wasn't any help. At the same time, I had a very provocative student who was 2 grades behind and who was just smug as hell. He always spent an unnerving amount of his potential trying to push his teacher's boundaries and see how far he could go. Luckily, I'm not that easy to anger and always try not to play into students' hands by doing exactly what they want me to do. So if I notice that somebody tries to anger me, I give my best to speak even more calmly, etc. When I was grading a test in politics, I noticed that he hadn't filled out a question, probably because he was once more oblivious to the answer. Instead, he had used his time during the test to draw a little sketch made of stick figures. One stick figure, labeled as me, had its hand on a lever, up on a risen platform with a gallows. The stick figure with the head in the noose was labeled with his own name. At the feet of the gallows, the rest of the class was protesting with signs saying, "Stop," or "Don't do it." Quote, I thought about what comment I might write next to it, when I remembered the training we were given over and over again. Obviously this student was in distress. So I contacted the school psychologist and mentioned the disquieting sketch on the test 2 days later. During my lesson, there was a knock on my door. It was the school counselor who came to get the student for a psychological assessment. The sour look he gave me when he came back was marvelous. I work at a school for the mentally and physically challenged, and as many issues that we have from the home, like abuse, non-attendance and general neglect. We have quite a few kids like that. I do exactly the same. Rather safe than sorry. Plus the added bonus of being able to say that I was only looking out for your kid. Perhaps remind him that other schools have taken such things as threats. And often the student in question gets a nice sit-down with psychologists connected strongly to the police. Not that you'd do any such thing. Less than sarcasm, of course, less than sarcasm. But you're just warning him that other teachers might. Do we have a term for weaponized compassion? Kids say all kinds of terrible things, and I take them seriously. The vast majority have no plan to harm themselves or others. But if they all know that such statements will be met with concern and follow-ups, they won't use them for disruptive purposes. I don't have stats to back it up, but it sure feels nicer not to walk through halls of people yelling about hurting people. He did it to himself. You really had no choice, right? Whenever I hear of people being abused and the abuser using unaliving themselves as a means of manipulation, I always tell them, believe it every time and get the trained people to do the work. You are not trained for this. If they are faking, the trained people will figure that out. If it is being used as a means of manipulation, there is now a paper trail. If it is real, their life is saved. No downside to this. Haha, I'm in danger. Ralph. Wow. It sounds like you took the appropriate steps to address the situation with the student's sketch. It's great that you reached out to the school psychologist for help. It's not really malicious. This is exactly what should happen. Does this qualify? Usually there are 2 parties, A and B. where A places some restriction and B uses to their advantage teaching A lesson. In this case, we have A, counselor, B, you, and C, student, where A placed a rule and you used it against C, while from the viewpoint of B, it is malicious. From A and C it's just compliance. Wow. Sounds like the school counselor was not happy with me for reporting the distressing sketch on the test. Nice post-op. You reminded me of a completely unrelated story from my teaching career. Retired 10 years this past spring. That I'm going to share anyway because I'm an old fart. I'll try to give a shortened version. At the end on one school day I noticed a former student standing in the hall outside my room. My students were supposed to be getting an early start on their homework. So I invited him into the room. After the bell rang and all of the students had left, he asked me, "Do you remember the day you took me out into the hall and told me you were fed up trying to get me to pass chemistry, and wouldn't bother anymore?" Quote, to be honest, I barely remembered, but admitted that it sounded about right. I do know that he didn't pass my chemistry class. He continued, "You told me that it was a shame I was wasting my time in school, but someday when I was fed up with my low pay, no future job, I should consider going to college because you knew I could do well." Now that sounded like me. For sure, he was bright, but not motivated in the least. You said that would happen when I was 27 years old. But you were wrong. It happened when I was 22. A year before it happened for me. Since I'm being honest, I kept thinking back to what you said. And last fall I started college. I made the dean's list for my first semester. And will make the dean's list this semester if all goes well. You were the only person who ever believed in me. And I needed to thank you. He missed it up. I missed it up. And being manly men who don't cry. He headed for the hallway and I headed for my prep room. I've never seen him since. But on occasion I remember that day. I just goes to show that even bad teaching techniques occasionally pay off big. Note. I do my best. But there was a reason I never, ever, considered being an English teacher. Comma error were a big thing in the 1960s and 70s that I never really understood. I'm not really sure I read this as student trying to piss the teacher off. If anything, it feels more like a very tongue-in-cheek, "Please have mercy on me because I don't remember the answers." I was a very forgetful student growing up. And I can tell you from experience how annoying and dispiriting it can be to have to say the same things every day in front of the entire class. I.e., I forgot my homework. I don't know the answer. Etc. It would get to the point where I'd start making up outrageous and very obvious lies just to try and make the teacher laugh. I don't have my homework. But only because my brother ate it. Quote, retired now. And so thankful to be far away from schools. This isn't compliance, but it's a story about recognizing a behavior issue. I was a young teacher, teaching high school freshman science. One day a kid who was normally okay, somewhat talkative but okay, was just out of control. Couldn't sit still, up all over the classroom, laughing uncontrollably. I walked over and casually grabbed his arm and took his pulse. It was racing. I sent another kid to walk with him to the nurse. She sent them both back in about 20 minutes. The other kid was pretty streetwise and after class said, "He's on something," and talked about how he was jumping up on a retaining wall and back off on the way to the nurse. After school, I went and asked the nurse about referrals to the principal and she said, "He just drank too much soda at lunch." Now, I'm not up on all the indicators of drug use. But this kid was much worse than a sugar high. So, what got me in trouble? The kid's mother was the manager where I banked. On my way home that day, I stopped and asked if she had a few minutes to talk. I told her he just seemed a bit different that day and I was concerned. I didn't tell her I thought he had taken something, but wanted her to know his behavior was off. Principal was really angry because she apparently called to ask how he was acting. The benefit. A couple of months later, I was in the bank and she came over and asked me to talk to her. I went to her office. She closed the door and said, "Thank you so much for caring about my son." Turned out, he was the youngest of the family by about 8 years. Had older brothers in their 30s and their father had died about a month prior. Why don't schools let teachers know when kids have trauma? The kid had taken something. No one ever told me what. But after talking to me that day, she called her older sons. One of them picked him up that night and monitored him. They all started paying more attention. Got him sorted out and he was much better by then. Haven't thought about that in years. I am so invested in this story. Is Todd okay? How is his tummy? Please update us op. I am worried about Lee.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Haircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.